In 1888, a county coroner in Greene County, Ohio, signed a death certificate that should not exist. It belonged to a black man named Caesar Bowen, and the age written at the bottom was 126 years old. Not a rumor. Not a family story. A legal document. Backed by 7 notarized affidavits, a cemetery ledger, and a stack of medical notes that even the coroner admitted contradict everything I know about the human body. But the real mystery didn't lie in his age. It lay in what they found inside his cabin. 63 handwritten journals, written in 3 different handwriting styles, all apparently his. Journals describing memories he should never have had. The middle passage, African villages, slave ships, events that happened before he was even born. Before we go deeper, subscribe and comment your country below. Because what you're about to hear is one of the most disturbing cold cases in American history. If one man carried the memories of hundreds of enslaved people, was he blessed, cursed, or something far more terrifying? The story begins in a room most people never see. Deep inside the Greene County Courthouse, past the public hallways and the marriage license window, there is a cramped, dust-choked archive room where the oldest records of Ohio sleep under layers of time. The air is dry. The lights flicker. Boxes lean like tired men. Nothing in this room is meant to be exciting. These are supposed to be the quiet bones of history, birth records, tax forms, forgotten land disputes. But in 1972, a county historian opened one of these drawers and froze. Because inside a file labeled Bowen, Caesar, Age Dispute, sat a death record that couldn't be explained by any rational measure. The document was simple at first glance. A standard death certificate, dated January 1888, written in careful ink strokes by the county coroner, Dr. William Hayes. Age of deceased, 126 years. Cause of death, systemic failure associated with extreme aging. But it was the handwritten note at the margin that sent a shiver down the historian's spine. Age cannot be medically confirmed, but physical indicators suggest extreme longevity beyond documented human capacity. Coroner Hayes was not a sentimental man. His career was built on clinical detachment, sharp measurements, and ruling out superstition. But even he struggled to explain what he examined that winter afternoon. He wrote page after page of medical notes. Bone density inconsistent with normal aging, dental wear patterns impossible for any known human lifespan, skin degradation matching neither normal elderly anatomy nor any known disease. After 32 years of medical practice, Hayes quietly admitted, "If someone told me this man was 150, I could not argue with the physical evidence." It was as if the body had endured 2 lifetimes. The historian pushed deeper into the file. Newspaper clippings, personal testimonies, notarized affidavits from citizens who swore under oath that Caesar was old when I was a child, and ancient even in my grandfather's time. 7 separate people wrote nearly the same sentence. I do not know a time when he was not already old. That consistency alone made the county archivist nervous. Documents lie. People exaggerate. But when multiple sources, across multiple generations, repeat the same impossible truth, the line between myth and history begins to blur. The archivist flipped to the next document, the cemetery ledger from Woodland Cemetery in Xenia. There it was again, carved into the record with quiet certainty. Bowen Caesar. Born 1762. Died 1888. The dates weren't penciled in later. They weren't altered or smudged. They were written with the same pen, same pressure, same ink as the entries above and below. The cemetery caretaker who recorded the information in 1888 was known for strict accuracy, the kind of man who measured grave plots twice and corrected neighbors over spelling mistakes. His record stood untouched for nearly a century. And then came the item that sealed the mystery, a faded black and white photo of Caesar's headstone, taken in the 1940s. The stone itself was rough, hand-cut, weathered by cold Ohio winters. But the engraving was unmistakable. Caesar Bowen, 1762 to 1888. He remembered. A strange epitaph, unusual, poetic, chosen intentionally by someone who knew something. The narrator pauses here, letting the weight settle for the viewer. Because this wasn't just about age. Anyone can make a claim, stories stretch over time. But the paperwork, the cold, bureaucratic machinery of 3 different institutions, all lined up. The courthouse, the cemetery, the coroner's office, all treating Caesar Bowen as a man genuinely born during the reign of King George III. To put this in perspective, Caesar would have been a young man when George Washington was inaugurated. He would have been middle-aged during the War of 1812. He would have been elderly during the Civil War. And he died when electric street lights were beginning to appear across the Midwest. One human life spanning from the powdered wigs of colonial America to the age of railroads and steel. And yet the deeper the historian looked, the stranger it became. Because Caesar's case wasn't hidden, not originally. It was documented, stamped, notarized, stored. But what was hidden was the discomfort, the silence, the quiet agreement among local officials and historians to stop asking questions that led nowhere safe. They had tried to understand, tried to examine, tried to explain. And at some point they gave up and pushed the file into the archive like a dangerous object best left untouched. The sheriff's note from 1888 was particularly revealing. Multiple citizens claim impossible longevity. I decline to endorse supernatural explanations. Recommend no further inquiry. No further inquiry. A polite way of saying, this is too strange, too threatening, too disruptive. Leave it alone. But history doesn't stay buried forever. Eventually someone opens the drawer. The narrator leans further toward the viewer now, voice lower, colder, as if sharing a secret that should not be spoken too loudly. Imagine standing in that archive room, holding a piece of paper that quietly insists a human being lived longer than any verified person in recorded history. Would you believe the document? Or would you convince yourself it had to be a clerical error, because the alternative was too disturbing? The camera in your mind shifts. The old courthouse, dim light flickering on a dusty metal drawer, one fragile file containing a man who lived beyond science. This is where the mystery begins. Not with a legend, not with folklore, but with official documents that simply do not make sense. 1888, Greene County, Ohio. One old man. One impossible age. One file the county could never explain. Would you dig deeper, or quietly close the drawer and walk away? 2 miles outside the quiet streets of Xenia, Ohio, there once stood a cabin that people in town spoke about in lowered voices. It sat at the edge of a clearing where the trees pressed close together, their branches trapping the wind and bending the sunlight in uneasy ways. Farmers said the place always felt a little colder than the land around it, even in summer. Children dared each other to run past it at night. And for decades, if anyone asked why the cabin tilted the way it did, why the chimney leaned like it was bowing under an invisible weight, locals had only one answer: that's Caesar Bowen's place. But the structure itself told a deeper story. The logs were hand-hewn in the old style, dark, almost black from age, fitted together with skill that suggested the builder learned his craft in another century. The chimney stones were irregular, mismatched, stacked by a hand that cared more for survival than beauty. The cedar shingles on the roof were pinned down with river stones, a construction technique that hadn't been used in Ohio since the early 1800s. Most houses built in that era were gone by the 1880s. Yet Caesar's cabin remained, weather-beaten and crooked but still standing, as if held up by stubbornness alone. Inside it was dim even during daylight. The single window was small, warped in its frame. Dust hung in the air like suspended time. Everything smelled faintly of cedar, old leather, and the faint sweetness of tobacco, scents that seemed permanently soaked into the wood. Neighbors said the place never fully warmed, not even with a fire roaring in the hearth. Widow Martha Hewitt once told a visiting deacon, "You step inside and it feels like the past is still breathing in the walls." People in Xenia knew Caesar by sight. A bent, narrow man walking the dirt roads with a gnarled hickory cane he claimed to have cut in 1799. He was barely 5 feet tall, his back curved like an ancient branch, his clothes patched and mended until the original fabric was a mystery. But no one ever forgot his eyes, pale brown, almost the color of creek water over sand, startling in their clarity. When he looked at you, he didn't blink like other old men. He watched. He studied. And people often found themselves looking away first, unsettled by something they could not name. He didn't talk much. When he did, his voice was thin, sandpaper dry, and so soft that grown men leaned in to hear him. Sometimes he used words people hadn't heard since childhood Bible readings. Thee, thou, I reckon not. It has been many a year. It wasn't affectation. He simply spoke like someone who had never updated his vocabulary. Kids whispered rumors about him. Some swore they saw him walking at dawn long before any normal person woke. Others claimed he moved without making sound on gravel. One boy insisted that Caesar's shadow didn't always match his body, that sometimes it leaned in the opposite direction of the sun. Adults dismissed the stories but rarely challenged them, because even grown men admitted privately that something about Caesar felt older than age, older than America itself. He lived alone, surviving on odd jobs. Harness repairs, sharpening tools, fixing broken chair legs or mending worn leather. No one knew how he learned these skills or who had taught him, but his hands, twisted with arthritis, the knuckles swollen into knots, moved with surprising precision. Watching him work was like watching someone perform a ritual they had practiced for centuries. Dr. Harold Sutton, the town physician, visited the cabin more times than he liked to admit. Each time, he felt the same sensation entering through the crooked doorway, a prickling on his arms, like stepping into air that didn't belong to the present day. Sutton tried to dismiss it as temperature change or nerves, but the feeling never fully disappeared. He had been trying to examine Caesar properly for years. Each attempt ended in the same quiet resistance. "Man's vitals are impossible," he told his wife over supper one evening in 1887. "His pulse sits around 40 beats per minute. His respiration barely rises above sleep state levels. And yet he is fully alert." His wife hesitated. "Perhaps he's simply very healthy for his age." "That's just it, Margaret. If his records are correct, if he truly is 125 years old, then he should not be alive. There is no precedent in medical literature for a human body enduring that long." He didn't tell her the part that bothered him most. Caesar's eyes always seemed to know what questions he hadn't yet asked. Sutton wasn't the only one unsettled. Store owners said Caesar never seemed to hurry, yet he always arrived at exactly the moment he was needed. A broken latch on the feed store door? Caesar walked in minutes later with his tools. A snapped harness on a farmer's mule? Caesar would appear on the road just as the farmer cursed the heavens. Too many coincidences for comfort. And then there were the winter nights when travelers swore they saw a dim light in Caesar's cabin, flickering rapidly like multiple lanterns moving at once, long before anyone knew about the 63 journals piled inside. The narrator's voice slows now, lowering like a candle flame bending in a draft. Imagine the scene. A crooked cabin at the edge of a clearing. An old man who never seemed to age the way others did. Eyes too clear. Silence too deep. Stories too old for one lifetime. This was the backdrop of Caesar Bowen's life in the 1880s, a place where the air felt heavier than the land around it, where time didn't seem to pass the way it should, and where the oldest man in Ohio walked the dirt roads like a ghost who refused to leave. 1880s Ohio. One crooked cabin. One man walking out of another century. Would you speak to him? Or keep your distance? If the mystery of Caesar Bowen had ended with eyewitness accounts and local rumors, historians would have dismissed him as folklore, just another small-town legend born from curiosity and fear. But the deeper you dig into the archives, the more the paper trail begins to look like a quiet rebellion against the limits of human biology. Documents don't bend for stories. They don't exaggerate. They don't protect myths. And yet, every official record tied to Caesar leads in one direction. He was far older than any man should have been. The paper trail begins not in Ohio, but in Tidewater, Virginia, the plantation region where America's early wealth soaked into the soil through the suffering of enslaved people. In a brittle ledger from the late 1700s, the name Caesar appears beside the notation, adult Negro of significant years. No age, no origin, just those three words, significant years. Words chosen by someone who either couldn't be bothered with precision, or by someone who genuinely couldn't determine how old he was. That ledger is the first real clue that Caesar's lifespan may have already been unusual before he ever arrived in Ohio. The next document in the trail is the one that historians often reread 3 or 4 times, as if waiting for the ink to rearrange itself into something less unbelievable. The manumission document of July 4, 1826. Freedom Papers, written on the nation's 50th anniversary. In dark, authoritative pen strokes it reads, "Caesar, Negro man, aged approximately 64 years, is hereby freed from the service of Jeremiah Hawthorne of Virginia." The narrator pauses, letting the meaning settle. If Caesar was approximately 64 in 1826, that places his birth around 1762, the year King George III was still tightening his grip on the colonies. Before Washington. Before the American Revolution. Before the United States even existed. But the document offers more than a number. It offers a contradiction no historian has been able to reconcile. Because it also states, he has been in the Hawthorne family since 1784, purchased as an adult Negro of significant years. Adult Negro. Significant years. Purchased as already old in 1784. Even a conservative estimate suggests Caesar was over 30 when he was bought in 1784, meaning the 64 written in 1826 wasn't overestimated, it might have been understated. The narrator leans forward in tone, giving viewers the same sensation of discovery researchers feel in archive rooms. When historians stitch this timeline together, something disturbing emerges. Caesar may have been elderly before America was even a country. Census records paint an even stranger picture. Between 1830 and 1870, for federal census entries list his age as 1830, 68, 1840, 77, 1850, 88, 1860, 97, 1870, 107. Every record shows him aging slower than he should. From 1830 to 1840, he ages 9 years. From 1840 to 1850, he ages 11 years. But then, from 1850 to 1860, he jumps only 9 years again. From 1860 to 1870, he ages 10. Not a straight line. Not human aging. Something else. The narrator slows. By the time of the 1870 census, he should have been dead. Not by a year or two. By decades. Yet there he was, listed again as if time had been warned not to touch him too quickly. And this wasn't clerical laziness. Multiple different census takers in different decades recorded him, each noting his advanced age with a kind of bewildered respect. One census enumerator wrote beside his entry, "Appears much older than declared age. Claims memory of war with British." Not the Civil War, the Revolutionary War. This wasn't folklore. This wasn't exaggeration. These were federal records. But the most compelling documents came from people, not institutions. 7 notarized affidavits, legally binding statements from respected residents, each swearing under oath that they had known Caesar since their own childhoods, and that he had appeared older than any man I had seen even then. One affidavit, signed by a former sheriff in 1859, reads, "My father spoke of Caesar as old when he was a boy. The man does not seem bound to the years the rest of us count." Another from a schoolteacher. "I do not know a time in which he was ever young." These weren't people sitting around telling ghost stories. They were officers, landowners, teachers, people whose signatures meant something. The narrator's tone darkens as if revealing a secret the past tried to hide. When you assemble all these fragments, plantation ledgers, manumission papers, census records, affidavits, the grave marker, they form a timeline no historian wants to acknowledge. A timeline in which one man appears, fully grown in the 1780s, still strong enough to work in the 1820s, walking 2 miles into town in the 1870s, alive and alert in the 1880s, and finally dying at an age that pushes far past any verified human longevity in recorded history. Paper doesn't bend to myth. Ink doesn't stretch to fit legends. And yet the documents remain. The narrator raises a chilling thought. If the paperwork of 3 states all tells the same impossible story, at what point does impossibility stop being an excuse? The paper trail forces one conclusion, a conclusion uncomfortable, unsettling, and ignored for over a century. Either the records of Virginia, Ohio, and the federal government are all wrong, or Caesar Bowen lived longer than any man should and no one understood why. From Tidewater to Ohio, one truth followed him through the archives. Caesar was always old. When the documents refused to lie, what explanation would you dare believe? Dr. Harold Sutton never meant to become part of a mystery. He was a practical man, a physician trained in Cincinnati, proud of his education, proud of his ability to explain things ordinary people found frightening. Fever, infection, childbirth, consumption, apoplexy. Sutton believed every human condition could be reasoned out, measured, charted, diagnosed. Before he met Caesar Bowen, his world was simple. The body obeyed rules and his job was to understand them. But Caesar was the one patient who made his textbooks feel useless. Sutton first heard about the old man in the early 1870s, when townspeople described him in passing. "He's older than he looks, or maybe older than he should look." Farmers mentioned him casually. Shopkeepers chuckled about his odd speech. But it wasn't until Sutton saw Caesar with his own eyes that he realized something was profoundly wrong. One crisp October morning, Sutton was leaving the apothecary when he saw a small, hunched figure making his way down the dirt road. The man moved slowly but deliberately, leaning on a gnarled cane. His coat was patched, his boots worn nearly to holes. But Sutton didn't notice the clothes. He noticed the eyes, unnervingly clear, pale brown like running water over sand. Eyes that belonged to someone who had witnessed too much. "Good morning, sir," Sutton had said politely. Caesar paused, turned his head, and stared with a focus that made the doctor's heartbeat stutter. It wasn't suspicion. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't even hostility. It was recognition. As if this old man had already known the doctor long before they met. "Morning, doctor," Caesar whispered. Sutton felt the hair on his arms rise. Caesar shouldn't have known who he was. The doctor had only been in town a few months and Caesar rarely interacted with newcomers. But the old man turned and shuffled away, leaving Sutton standing speechless in the street. By 1883, the doctor's curiosity had grown into an obsession disguised as medical concern. Sutton began making house calls to Caesar's cabin, bringing medicines the old man never accepted. Each visit was the same, the cabin cool, a faint smell of cedar in the air, Caesar seated in his worn chair near the fireplace, head bent, hands resting lightly on his cane. On one such visit, Sutton decided to perform a full examination. Caesar didn't resist, he simply watched him with those unsettling eyes. The doctor took his pulse. Slow. Too slow. 40 beats per minute, the resting heart rate of an elite athlete, not a man in his 90s or older. He checked respiration. Barely above 8 breaths per minute, deep, steady, almost meditative. He tested reflexes. Dulled but present, inconsistent with normal aging. He examined the skin. Paper thin, stretched over bones in ways that suggested a body at the limits of existence. When Sutton placed his stethoscope against Caesar's back, he paused. The old man's lungs expanded with effortless calm. No rattle, no wheeze, no sign of weakness. It made no sense. "Do you feel pain?" the doctor asked. Caesar didn't answer at first. His eyes drifted to the small window where a sliver of winter light clung to the glass. Then he whispered, "Pain comes and goes. But age stays." The doctor scribbled notes even though he had no category to fit any of it. In the margins of his medical journal, he wrote, "Physiological presentation impossible. Vitals do not correspond to age or condition. Patient's body behaves as if it is ancient yet preserved." That word, preserved, would follow Dr. Sutton for the rest of his life. One evening in late 1887, Sutton sat at his dinner table, the lamplight trembling over his plate. His wife, Margaret, watched him chew without enthusiasm. "You're thinking about that man again?" she said gently. He didn't deny it. "His vitals contradict every medical principle I know." Margaret folded her hands. "Perhaps he is simply blessed with unusual health." Sutton shook his head. "No, blessed is not the word. If anything, it feels like a burden. His body seems held together by something other than nature. I can't explain it." She hesitated before speaking again. "Maybe not everything needs explaining." The doctor set down his fork. "That is precisely the problem. I built my career on explanations. But this man unsettles me." He didn't tell her the truth, the thing he hadn't dared write in his journal. Caesar made him feel watched, measured, studied, as if the old man was waiting for something, or someone, to catch up to him. Sutton's frustration grew into something darker, a need to understand. He began digging through old county records, cross-checking census notes, collecting whispers from townspeople. Every fact unraveled logic rather than reinforcing it. One afternoon, he confided to a colleague passing through town, "I have a patient whose age is impossible." "How impossible?" "Over a century. Nearly 2. His colleague laughed. "Nonsense. Delusion surely." Sutton stared him down. "I've examined his body. I've read the documents. I've spoken to people who knew him for decades. If it is nonsense, then reality itself is lying." The colleague walked away unsettled. Back at the cabin, Sutton noticed details he had never dared acknowledge before. The shadows inside seemed too still. The air felt thicker than the cold outside. And Caesar, seated quietly in his chair, always seemed to be listening, not to the doctor, but to something the doctor could not hear. Sometimes Caesar lifted his head as if hearing distant footsteps. Sometimes he whispered names under his breath, names Sutton did not recognize. But the moment that finally broke the doctor's certainty came on a frigid December morning. Sutton placed his stethoscope against Caesar's chest. No heartbeat. For a split second, the doctor froze. His eyes widened. His breath hitched. Then one slow, heavy beat thumped through the chest cavity. Then another. Each one separated by a gap so long it bordered on death. Sutton pulled back, shaken. How are you alive?" Caesar opened his eyes and whispered, "I've lived too long, doctor. But time will catch me eventually." The narrator's voice lowers now, steady and grim. For Dr. Harold Sutton, a man who believed the human body obeyed rules, Caesar Bowen became the one case he could never solve. The one patient who stood outside the boundaries of medicine, time, and reason. And before the winter ended, the doctor would witness something far worse than an impossible pulse. He would watch a man begin to unravel. A country doctor. A patient who defied biology. And a mystery science could not confront. If you were a doctor and your patient didn't follow any rule of nature, would you keep examining him, or run? By the summer of 1885, the legend of the old man outside Xenia had become a local curiosity, strange enough to whisper about, harmless enough to ignore. Most townsfolk simply accepted Caesar as part of the landscape, like the crooked fence near Mill Creek or the abandoned mill that creaked in the wind. But in July of that year, a young reporter named Thomas Fletcher stepped off the train from Cincinnati and found himself caught in the gravitational pull of Caesar Bowen's mystery. Fletcher wasn't looking for a scandal. He wasn't even looking for a mystery. His editor had assigned him a harmless human interest piece. Write about the oldest resident in Greene County. Make it sweet. Make it readable. Page 3 material. It was supposed to be a quick assignment before he returned to covering railroad disputes and local elections. He imagined an hour-long chat with a feeble old man. A couple quotes about the good old days. Maybe a sentimental line about the changing world. What he found instead was a story so dark, so expansive, and so disturbing that he later described it as 4 hours inside the mind of someone who had lived too long. The day he arrived at Caesar's cabin, the air outside was blistering, heavy with July heat that clung to the skin. But when Fletcher stepped through the crooked doorway, a cold draft brushed his neck. The cabin was unnaturally cool, almost cave-like, as if sunlight refused to enter. Caesar was sitting in his usual place by the empty fireplace, hands folded over his cane, head bowed slightly. "Mr. Bowen?" Fletcher asked. The old man looked up, and Fletcher later wrote that the first thing he noticed wasn't the wrinkles or the thinness or the frailty, but the eyes. They were not old. They were ancient, and they studied him with a clarity that felt almost invasive. "Sit," Caesar whispered. Fletcher sat. He opened his notebook, ready for small talk. Instead, Caesar asked him a question. "How long have you lived, boy?" Fletcher blinked, caught off guard. 29 years. Caesar gave a small nod. "You'll see much yet. If you're lucky." Fletcher tried to smile politely, not yet understanding the gravity of the moment. "And you, sir? How long have you lived?" The old man closed his eyes. "Too long." What began as a simple interview stretched into a 4-hour confession that Fletcher could barely keep up with. His hand cramped from writing. Sweat slid down his back despite the unnatural cold in the cabin. Caesar spoke slowly, but every sentence was loaded with sensory detail, as if he were describing events from yesterday, not centuries ago. "I remember the tobacco barns in Tidewater," Caesar said. "The way the leaves hung from the rafters like sleeping bodies. The smell, sweet, sharp, choking." His voice rasped, but the images were vivid enough to make Fletcher see them. He described his mother dying when he was a baby. He described the songs sung in the slave quarters, melodies carried from Africa but stripped of meaning, like ghosts humming to themselves. He described hunger that gnawed the belly until pain felt normal. "You must have seen many changes," Fletcher offered. Caesar's voice grew distant. "I saw the world split open more than once. I saw an empire fall. I saw slavery spread like a sickness, and I saw it die screaming. I saw men kill for land, for pride, for nothing at all." He lifted his eyes. "I saw things no one should have to remember." Fletcher's pen trembled slightly. This wasn't the sentimental interview his editor expected. This was something else. A man who carried not just memories but history. "Do you remember the revolution?" Fletcher asked, half joking, testing him. Caesar didn't smile. "I remember the Stamp Act riots. I remember when men shouted about freedom while holding chains in their hands. I remember winters so cold trees split open with a crack like gunfire." He paused. "That was before I was sold the first time." Fletcher's pen froze mid-sentence. Before he was born, America was still a colony. Now it was an industrializing nation. And this old man claimed to have witnessed both. As the hours passed, Caesar spoke of people Fletcher had never heard of. Enslaved mothers whose names never entered a record book, men who tried to escape and vanished, children sold away like livestock. He remembered their faces with unflinching clarity. Their voices, their grief. "They stay with me," Caesar whispered. "All of them. Their memories, their fears, their dying breaths. I carry what they cannot." Fletcher leaned in. "How can you remember so much?" Caesar looked at the ceiling, his expression unreadable. "Because forgetting is a mercy I was never given." The cabin seemed to grow colder. At one point, a beam of sunlight slipped through the cracked wall and fell on Caesar's hands, gnarled, twisted, thin as roots. Fletcher noticed something odd. The skin wasn't just aged. It looked worn, as if time had scraped at it like a blade. He scribbled a note in the margin. "Hands look older than human age." By the time Fletcher left the cabin, the sun was low and the cicadas screamed through the trees. He closed his notebook with shaking hands, the pages filled with stories far too dark for the county newspaper. He turned the piece in, but the editor skimmed it with a disapproving frown. "Cut all the unpleasant parts," he said. "This is supposed to be uplifting." Page 3. "Families read this." Fletcher protested. "But it's true." The editor shrugged. "Truth isn't always fit to print." Only a sanitized half-column made it to publication, a gentle puff piece about a remarkably long-lived former enslaved man. No horrors, no contradictions, no claims of memory stretching back to colonial America. But Fletcher kept his original pages, all of them, in a private folder in his desk drawer. The full testimony, the raw truth. Years later, those pages would become the most important evidence in the entire investigation. Because while the editor wanted a harmless story, Fletcher had discovered a man whose memory stretched beyond what a human being should carry. A man whose life ran parallel to the country's birth. A man who remembered too much. One young reporter. 4 hours of testimony. A story no editor wanted printed. If you heard a man speak as if he had lived 2 centuries, would you believe him, or think you'd gone mad? Winter crept into Greene County in 1887 with a strange heaviness, the kind that pressed against windows and made the air feel older than the season itself. By then, most people in town knew Caesar as the silent old man who walked the roads like a relic from another era. But no one expected what happened next, the moment his already quiet existence collapsed into absolute, terrifying silence. It was a mild October afternoon when neighbor Samuel Pritchard stopped by Caesar's cabin with a loaf of bread and a jug of warm broth. He found the old man sitting in his usual spot, the wooden chair by the cold fireplace, eyes fixed on a point no one else could see. Pritchard greeted him with his usual loud, friendly voice. "How you faring today, Caesar?" Caesar turned his head slowly. His lips parted. He inhaled to speak. And then, something changed. Pritchard would later describe it under oath. It was like he remembered something so terrible that the words froze inside him. Caesar's expression twisted, not in pain, not in confusion, but in recognition. His eyes widened, his mouth stayed open, but no sound came out. Then, with surprising strength for someone his age, he pushed Pritchard away and pointed to the door. He wanted him to leave. Immediately. Pritchard stumbled out of the cabin and stood in the yard, shaken. The door closed behind him with a soft thud. The woods around the clearing were quiet, too quiet, like every bird and insect was holding its breath. Something had changed inside that cabin. The next morning, Pritchard returned, this time with Dr. Harold Sutton. Snow flurries danced in the air and frost coated the ground. They found Caesar exactly where Pritchard had left him. Same chair. Same posture. Same expression carved into his face. But he was alive. His eyes followed them. He responded to touch. He breathed steadily. He just didn't speak. Not a whisper. Not a hum. The doctor examined his throat, checked his tongue, measured his reflexes. There was no stroke, no paralysis, no injury. "It's as if he has chosen silence," Sutton wrote in his notes. Then he added a second sentence he later regretted writing. But for what purpose? In the weeks that followed, the silence inside Caesar's cabin grew heavy, almost physical. Neighbors who brought food described the same sensation. The moment you stepped inside, the air pressed against your chest like deep water. Lamps flickered. Shadows seemed to stretch too far across the floor. And stranger things began happening. Children who walked past at dusk swore they saw Caesar through the window. They said his lips moved, rapidly, urgently, but no sound came out, as if he were speaking to someone unseen. Some claimed they heard faint murmuring from the trees, like distant voices carried on a wind that wasn't there. One boy insisted he saw Caesar's shadow one night, pointing away from the lantern inside, stretching across the ground in the opposite direction of the light. He ran home screaming. Adults dismissed the stories, but none of them walked past the cabin at night. Widow Martha Hewitt, who lived closest to Caesar, reported something even more unsettling. One November night, unable to sleep, she stepped onto her porch to breathe the cold air. That's when she heard it, faint singing drifting from Caesar's cabin. Not one voice. Not Caesar's voice. Multiple voices, layered together, harmonizing in a language she didn't recognize. She clutched her shawl tighter and prayed until the sound faded. The next morning, she marched to the cabin and confronted Caesar. She found him alone, sitting in silence. No footprints in the snow. No signs of visitors. No evidence of anyone else having been there at all. "I heard voices," she whispered. Caesar didn't move. didn't look at her. But she swore his eyes flickered, just once, as if acknowledging something she was never meant to hear. Through November and into December, Sutton visited Caesar repeatedly, documenting the deterioration that defied all medical logic. Caesar still ate, though mechanically without interest. He never left his chair. He rarely blinked. And sometimes, when the doctor spoke to him, his eyes seemed to follow figures moving through the room, figures Sutton could not see. One afternoon, Sutton noticed something else. While he reviewed his notes, Caesar's breathing changed. Slow, rhythmic, almost like chanting without sound. Sutton leaned closer. Caesar's lips weren't moving, but his throat was vibrating, softly, steadily, as if singing a song too old to have lyrics. The doctor froze. "This is not silence," he whispered to himself. "This is something else." Word spread quietly across the county that the old man has gone strange. Few dared to visit. But as winter deepened, Sutton felt an inexplicable pull, not as a physician, not as a scientist, but as a witness. He began to suspect Caesar wasn't losing his mind. Something was gathering inside him. Memories, voices, lives, like a dam straining under the weight of a rising flood. On December 20th, Sutton wrote his most chilling note yet. Patient silence is not absence. It is pressure. Something is building behind the eyes. By Christmas, the cabin had become a place no one wanted to approach. Some claimed the air around it shimmered in the cold. Others said they heard footsteps inside even when the windows were dark. A few swore the cabin itself groaned as if something enormous pressed against its walls from the inside. The narrator's voice grows low, tense. Then, as the year neared its end, Caesar's silence broke, not with words but with something far stranger. And what happened next would mark the beginning of his unraveling, and the darkest chapter in the entire investigation. An old man, a sudden silence, and a cabin where the air seemed to breathe. If someone stopped speaking overnight, not from injury, not from illness, but from something deeper, what would you think was happening to them? By January of 1888, Greene County lay frozen under a hard, unforgiving winter. The kind of cold that stiffened wood, cracked fence posts, and made every breath burn. Most people stayed inside their homes after dusk. But one night, long after midnight, Samuel Pritchard was startled awake by violent pounding on his front door. At first he thought it was the wind. Then the pounding came again, frantic, uneven, like someone striking the door with shaking fists. Pritchard lit a lantern, opened the door, and nearly dropped the flame. There, standing barefoot in the snow, wearing nothing but a thin nightshirt, was Caesar Bowen. His skin was pale, his breath sharp and ragged. Frost clung to his eyebrows. His hands trembled violently as if wrestling with some unseen force. "Caesar." Pritchard grabbed him by the shoulders. "What in God's name?" But before he finished, the old man collapsed into the snow. Pritchard cried out for his wife, dragged Caesar inside, and placed him near the fireplace. His skin was icy, his lips turning blue. And yet, his eyes were wide open, staring past the ceiling as if watching something unfold far beyond the room. Pritchard sent a neighbor running through the dark to fetch Dr. Harold Sutton. When Sutton arrived, he knelt beside Caesar and immediately felt the heat radiating from the old man's body. It made no sense. Caesar had been freezing minutes earlier, but now his skin burned like a stove plate. "Fever," Sutton whispered. "Fever will kill a man his age." But nothing about Caesar fit medical expectations. Within hours, the fever rose so high that the doctor fully expected Caesar's heart to give out. His breathing became ragged. His hands clenched the blankets with surprising strength. And then came the murmuring, a quiet whisper that slowly grew into fragmented speech. At first, Sutton thought he was delirious, muttering nonsense as the fever cooked his mind. But then the words sharpened. Names. Dozens of them. Abigail. Jonas. Scipio. Delilah. Samuel. His voice cracked with grief, pain, apology. "Forgive me. I tried. Don't take me yet." Then suddenly his voice deepened, shifting in tone, as if speaking from a different memory altogether. "They chained us, down in the dark, the air. His eyes flashed open, wide with terror. The smell, the sickness, the bodies. Sutton froze. The hairs on his neck rose one by one. Caesar wasn't describing anything that had ever happened to him. He was describing the Middle Passage, the slave ships, the suffocating holds, the months of death and despair across the Atlantic. But Caesar had been born in Virginia. He had said so himself. He had never crossed an ocean. "Caesar," Sutton whispered, "how do you know this?" The old man's voice trembled, as if each word came from a depth no human voice should reach. I remember the hold, the chains. I remember Africa. Sutton clenched his fists. You were never in Africa. Caesar's breathing hitched. Tears leaked from his eyes and slid into the pillow. But I see it, doctor. I smell it. I feel the iron on my wrists. I hear the crying, the prayers. I remember drowning, but I never left Virginia. The narrator lowers his voice, the tone shifting into a slow, suspenseful pull. It was a paradox no physician could diagnose, no historian could contextualize, no man could speak without sounding mad. A man remembering a life that wasn't his. A life lived thousands of miles away. A trauma he never experienced. A crossing he never made. But the details were right. Too right. Details no one in Ohio in 1888 would have known unless they had stood in the darkness of a slave ship's hold. For 3 days the fever raged. And for 3 days Caesar drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering more memories. Memories Sutton later cross-checked with plantation research, slave ship logs, and oral histories. Every match was exact. By the 4th day the fever broke. Caesar opened his eyes and looked directly into Sutton's. His voice was a fragile whisper, as if the fever had scraped raw whatever was inside him. How many years has it been? Sutton swallowed. Since when, Caesar? The old man stared up at the ceiling as if it were the sky. Since I was young. It was the first clear sentence he'd spoken in months. Then he fell into a sleep so deep Sutton had to hold a mirror under his nose to confirm breath. When Caesar began speaking again, sporadically in fractured sentences, Sutton documented every word, terrified of misinterpreting something that defied understanding. On February 3rd, Caesar said the line that changed the entire investigation. I should have died with the others. On the crossing. That's when it should have ended. But I was born here, so why do I remember it? The doctor wrote in his journal. Patient believes he carries memories predating his birth. Impossible. Yet he describes events with disturbing accuracy. This is no fevered imagination. When Sutton gently suggested these memories might be stories told to him, Caesar shook his head. No, these are mine, or someone's. I carry them like stones in my bones. Whose memories, Caesar? He breathed shakily. Too many to count. The narrator's voice shifts lower, the atmosphere tightening. That winter marked the beginning of what historians and physicians would later call the Bowen fracture. The point at which Caesar's memories began to spill over the edges of his mind. When the life he had lived, the lives he had witnessed, and the lives he should never have remembered began to blur into one unbearable weight. The fever didn't kill him. It opened a door. And once opened, that door refused to close. A barefoot old man collapsing in the snow. A fever that burned like judgment. And memories from an ocean he never crossed. If someone began remembering a life they never lived, would you call it madness or a warning? By late February 1888, the fever had passed, but something far more disturbing had taken its place. Whatever broke inside Caesar Bowen during those burning nights didn't heal. It widened. Piece by piece, it split open like a crack in the earth, spreading with every tremor underneath. Dr. Harold Sutton began visiting him daily, not because Caesar asked, but because the doctor felt compelled. As if he wasn't treating a man anymore, but observing the unraveling of a phenomenon he didn't yet understand. And then, one afternoon, Sutton witnessed something no medical training could explain. The cabin was quiet that day, lit only by a weak winter sun trickling through the gaps in the walls. Caesar sat in his usual chair, thin blanket over his shoulders, eyes half closed. Sutton spoke softly as he always did now. Caesar, can you hear me? The old man inhaled sharply, as if waking from a nightmare, and turned his head. At first his eyes were familiar, clear, pale brown, unsettlingly alert. But then something shifted behind them, like a lantern flame flickering in wind. He blinked once, twice, then spoke in a voice too light, too young to belong to a 126-year-old man. I'm in the field, the sun hurts my back. I'm only 12. Sutton froze. This wasn't Caesar's voice. Not in tone. Not in rhythm. Not in age. Before Sutton could respond, the voice changed again. Lower. Hoarser. Bitter. My hands, they burn from the pots. They never heal. Why won't they heal? Then another voice. Female this time. I miss my children. Why did they take them? Why did they take them? Sutton felt a chill crawl across his scalp. Caesar wasn't simply confused. He was becoming other people. Voices, dialects, ages, all emerging through the same failing body. A full fragmentation of identity. Thomas Fletcher rushed to the cabin within the hour after Sutton sent word. The moment he walked in, Caesar shifted again, this time speaking in a clipped coastal Gullah dialect, describing a marshland plantation no one in Greene County had ever seen. Then he switched. Maryland dialect. Then Tidewater, Virginia. Then a deep West African cadence, words neither man recognized. Every time he changed voices, his posture changed with it. His breathing shifted. His facial tension morphed, as if these weren't impressions but embodiments. Full identities flickering through a failing vessel. Fletcher whispered, horrified, "Is this possession?" Sutton shook his head, though not with certainty. "No. Possession is an external force. This is internal. Like multiple lives are surfacing at once. Like the boundary between them has collapsed." As they watched, Caesar straightened suddenly, shoulders broadening, voice deepening. "I'm running, through the forest, following the North Star, feet bleeding, can't stop, can't go back." His body curled inward. Then another voice burst forth, raw, panicked. "Don't take my babies, please, please." The sound tore through the cabin. Sutton covered his mouth. Fletcher lowered his notebook, hands shaking. These weren't hallucinations. These were testimonies. Dozens, maybe hundreds. As if Caesar were a library with its shelves collapsing, every book falling open at the same time. 3 days of this followed. Caesar cycled through voices until Sutton counted more than 40 distinct personas. Ages ranging from children to elders. Men and women. Rural and urban. Educated and uneducated. African-born. American-born. Mississippi accents. Carolina accents. Louisiana Creole cadences. All of it flowing out of a single withered body. At times he wept. At times he laughed. At times he screamed as if being whipped. At times he whispered lullabies in languages no one could place. It became clear that these weren't random delusions. They were memories of enslaved people whose lives had intersected with Caesar's, or whose lives Caesar had somehow absorbed through whatever ritual Amarachi performed decades earlier. A living archive cracking open. On March 2nd, something changed. Caesar stopped screaming, stopped cycling, stopped shifting. He sat upright suddenly, almost violently, as if pulled by invisible strings. His eyes were wide, unblinking, pupils blown open. Sutton and Fletcher stood frozen. Then the cabin filled with sound. Multiple voices came out of Caesar at once. Not one layered voice. Not two. Dozens. A monstrous chorus of men, women, and children overlaying each other. Speaking, chanting, arguing, mourning. A sound that pressed against the walls. A sound that felt older than America. A sound no human throat should be able to make. Martha Hewitt, standing outside with a basket of food, dropped it and fled. Inside, Dr. Sutton's medical instincts abandoned him. Every hair on his body stood on end. The air thickened as if weighted by the pressure of something unearthly. "Caesar!" Fletcher shouted. "Stop, you're hurting yourself." But the voices only grew louder, swirling and crashing like storm waves. For 30 terrifying seconds, the chorus expanded. Voices from fields. Voices from cabins. Voices from ships. Voices from prayers whispered into dirt. Then silence. Sudden. Absolute. Caesar slumped forward, gasping for breath. When he looked up again, his voice was his own. "I'm not alone anymore," he whispered. "They're all here." Sutton knelt beside him. "What is happening to you, Caesar?" The old man closed his eyes. "The years I borrowed are returning," he said. "The memories I carried are waking." A long, trembling breath. "And soon they will reclaim what was never mine to keep." The narrator's voice slows, deepens. This was more than illness, more than age, more than trauma. This was the beginning of a collapse, or a release, that no doctor, historian, or investigator was prepared to understand. An old man, a mind breaking open, and the voices of the dead rising with it. If someone began speaking in dozens of voices, would you call it madness, or memory finally demanding justice? By early April 1888, the people of Greene County whispered that something was wrong near the old clearing by Mill Creek. Animals wouldn't go near the cabin. Dogs stopped barking when they passed it. Even the wind seemed to avoid the place, as if nature itself refused to disturb whatever was unfolding inside. But the truth, the terrifying truth, would reveal itself on the night of April 27th. A night no one would forget. A night when 3 witnesses stood inside Caesar Bowen's cabin and heard something they would never be able to explain. Dr. Sutton arrived just before dusk, carrying his worn leather bag and a new journal. The last one had filled up faster than he dared admit. Fletcher arrived minutes later, having traveled from Cincinnati on urgent telegram. The moment he stepped off the carriage, he felt it, the sensation of walking toward something wrong, something heavy, as if the earth beneath his boots held a secret pressing upward. Samuel Pritchard met them at the door. "He's bad today," the farmer whispered. "Worse than before." Inside, the air felt alive. Thick, charged, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. Caesar sat in his chair, the same chair he'd barely left all winter, but his posture was different. Too straight, too steady. His eyes were wide, pupils large and cloudy, as if he were staring through the walls into something distant. "Caesar?" Sutton asked softly. The old man didn't move. Then, without warning, he inhaled sharply, a sound that made all three men flinch. And the voices began. At first it was one voice. Ragged. Mel. "I remember the river, cold, black. I ran, they caught me." Caesar wasn't speaking. Or at least his lips weren't moving. The voice came from him, yet also around him, echoing oddly as if vibrating through the cabin itself. Then another voice layered over it. Higher. Female. Shaking with grief. My babies, they sold my babies." Fletcher stepped back, hand over his mouth. Sutton whispered, "My God." Then a third voice, and a fourth, and then a fifth. Within seconds, the cabin filled with overlapping testimonies. Chains, the water, the dark. Forgive me. They whipped him. I saw his bones. Don't leave me, please don't leave me." Voices of men, voices of women, voices of children, all coming from a single frail body. And yet, none of them were Caesar's. Pritchard fell to his knees. "Is he dying?" Sutton grabbed his arm. "No, this is something else." The doctor couldn't explain what he meant. He only felt it, a sensation that the air around Caesar was thinning, trembling, as if unseen hands pressed against the walls of reality. Caesar's body convulsed, once violently, and then went completely still. Slowly, agonizingly, his lips parted. For the first time in days, he spoke in his own voice. "They're coming." Fletcher leaned forward. "Who's coming, Caesar?" Caesar's head turned toward the empty corner of the room, the one place where the shadows pooled unnaturally deep. "The ones I remember," he whispered. "All of them." The lanterns flickered, and the temperature in the cabin dropped by at least 20 degrees. What happened next defied every natural law. The walls groaned, not from wind but from pressure inside the room. The shadows shifted, stretching across the floor like long fingers. And then, a sound rose from the corner. A low hum. Dozens of voices, humming the same tune. An old tune. A sorrowful tune. A tune that no living person should have known. Fletcher whispered, shaking, "That's a slave hymn. One of the lost ones, the ones nobody recorded." Sutton felt his heartbeat hammering in his ears. How does he know it? Pritchard backed away toward the door, making the sign of the cross. "That ain't him knowing it," he whispered. "That's them." The humming grew louder. And then, abruptly, it turned into chanting, rhythmic, powerful, layered with pain and strength. Caesar gasped, clutching the arms of his chair. "They're not memories anymore," he said. "They're here." Sutton stepped forward. "Caesar, what is happening to you?" For the first time that night, the old man looked directly at him, and for a moment, his eyes were no longer brown. They were gray, clouded, translucent, like the eyes of someone who had seen too much. "The borrowed years," Caesar whispered, "are coming due." The next moment came without warning. The lantern flames shot upward. The floorboards shuddered, and a sound erupted from Caesar's chest, a multi-layered growl of voices that did not belong in this world. Dozens of them. Hundreds even, all speaking at once. A tidal wave of testimony crashing through a single human throat. Voices crying. Voices singing. Voices pleading. Voices remembering. Fletcher dropped his notebook. Sutton stumbled backward. Pritchard slammed into the wall, whispering prayers. The voices rose higher and higher until the sound almost broke the air, and then, silence. Not peaceful silence. Not empty silence. A silence so complete it felt carved out of the world. Caesar slumped back in his chair, chest heaving. When he spoke again, his voice was his own, small, thin, trembling. "It's starting." Sutton knelt before him. "What is?" "The release." Caesar's eyes filled with tears, the first they had ever seen from him. "I carried them," he whispered, "for lifetimes. Now they want their time back." The narrator's voice deepens, heavy with dread. That night marked the turning point. Not just in Caesar's decline, but in his unraveling into something unexplainable. Because what came for him after this night was not madness. It was memory returning to claim its debt. A cracking mind, a chorus of the dead, and a cabin holding more souls than one man could bear. If you witnessed a room filled with voices no living person could speak, would you call it haunting or justice long overdue? After the night the cabin filled with impossible voices, Greene County held its breath. No one approached the clearing unless duty forced them. No one lingered on the road that passed through the trees. And even the bravest farmers refused to walk past Caesar Bowen's home after sundown. Inside the cabin, something had changed, not just in Caesar but in the very air around him. Dr. Harold Sutton felt it the moment he stepped through the door the following morning. The temperature was wrong, he later wrote. It wasn't cold. It wasn't warm. It felt empty, as if the air had been hollowed out. Caesar sat in his chair, awake but unnaturally still. Not sleeping. Not alert. Something in between, like a lantern with no wick left, only faint embers trembling inside. Fletcher arrived soon after. The reporter had not slept. His face was pale, eyes dark with unease, but he came anyway because something told him the story had entered its final hours. And they were witnesses now, whether they wanted to be or not. Sutton knelt beside Caesar. "How do you feel today?" The old man moved his hand with effort, as if lifting stone instead of flesh. "Lighter," he whispered, "and heavier." Sutton frowned. "What do you mean?" Caesar blinked slowly, his eyes unfocused, drifting across the room as if following invisible figures. "The weight, the burden, the years I carried." A shudder ran through him. "They're returning to their owners." Fletcher leaned forward. "Do you understand what's happening to you?" Caesar nodded weakly, the gesture small but certain. For the first time in a century, yes. He spoke slowly, but his words carried a chilling clarity, the clarity of a man no longer fighting his fate. "When I was a child," Caesar said, "Amarachi placed something inside me. A vessel, a bridge, a space where the memories of my people could live if their bodies did not." He swallowed painfully. "I did not understand it then. I only knew I saw things others did not, felt what they felt, carried what they carried." He closed his eyes. "And with every story I took in, I gained years." Sutton whispered, "Borrowed years." Caesar nodded. "But time," he said softly, "never forgets what it lends." The narrator deepens his voice. This was Caesar's truth, the truth no medical document could explain, no historian could categorize. He wasn't simply old. He wasn't merely long-lived. He was a container, a living archive, a vessel that had reached the end of its capacity. And now every memory, every stolen year, was returning to its rightful owner. Fletcher opened his notebook. His hand trembled as he wrote. "Caesar," he said, "what happens when all the memories return?" Caesar's voice thinned to a whisper. "I disappear." The words were simple, final, without fear. Sutton's throat tightened. "Caesar, is there anything we can do? Anything at all?" The old man smiled, a small, weary, grateful expression. "You have already done it. You wrote. You listened. You witnessed. That is all I ever needed." Then his posture stiffened. A ripple went through him, a sudden, sharp convulsion that made his bones crack audibly. Sutton lunged forward. "Caesar." But the old man gripped the doctor's hand with surprising strength. "It's happening," he gasped. The release. What followed was not a scream, not a cry, but a breath, long, hollow, echoing from a place beyond the human lung. Caesar's eyes rolled upward, turning pale, almost white. The temperature in the room dropped instantly. Frost crawled across the window glass. The wooden floor creaked under unseen pressure. Then the voices returned. Not the chaotic chorus of days before. Not screaming. Not chanting. But whispering. Hundreds of whispers. Soft, sharp, close. So close they brushed the ears of every man in the room. Fletcher jerked back, knocking over a lamp. Pritchard pressed himself into the corner, shaking. But Sutton held Caesar's hand tightly, refusing to move. A whisper slid through the room like a draft. "She took my babies." Another followed. "They burned him in the field." Then another. "I crossed the river. I never saw my sister again." Voices of people long dead. Voices Caesar had carried. Voices returning home. The shadows on the wall shifted, bending unnaturally, stretching toward Caesar as if drawn to him. But they weren't hostile. They were reclaiming. Claiming their time. Their pain. Their stories. claiming what had been borrowed. Suddenly the whispering stopped. Caesar exhaled, a long sigh fragile as ash. His eyes lowered. His body relaxed. His hand slipped from Sutton's grasp. He whispered one last sentence. I was never meant to live forever. Only long enough. Fletcher stepped closer, voice shaking. Long enough for what? Caesar's lips curved faintly. To remember. Then his head bowed. His breathing slowed. And for a moment, everything in the cabin, the air, the walls, the shadows, seemed to wait. As if time itself held its breath. Sutton pressed his fingers to Caesar's neck. The pulse was faint. Slipping. Softening. The doctor whispered, not yet. Not yet. But Caesar's last breath slipped silently between his lips. Then, a final whisper passed through the room. A ripple. A sigh. A release. The lantern flames steadied. The shadows retreated. The air warmed. And Caesar Bowen, the man who carried a century of suffering in his bones, fell completely, utterly still. The narrator speaks quietly, reverently. A death not of one man, but of many stories leaving their vessel. A final accounting of borrowed time. If a man's memories were not his own, what truly dies when his heart stops? When Caesar Bowen's final breath slipped into silence, Dr. Harold Sutton did what any physician would do. He checked again, and again, and then a third time, because something inside him refused to believe the body before him had finally surrendered. For a man who had survived war, famine, fever, and the unimaginable burden of hundreds of memories, death felt too small a word to describe what had just happened. Fletcher stood beside him, hat clutched in trembling fingers. Is it over? He whispered. Sutton didn't look up. Yes, he said softly. But I don't know if what died today was only Caesar. Outside the wind had stopped. The woods around the cabin were frighteningly still, as if the earth itself paused to witness the passing of a man who had lived longer than a century of recorded American history. The county coroner, Dr. William Hayes, arrived an hour later, a practical, skeptical man with 30 years of experience and no patience for superstition. But the moment he stepped inside the cabin, he hesitated. Sutton, he said quietly, why is it so cold in here? Sutton said nothing. Hayes knelt beside the body. At first, his movements were mechanical, checking rigor, examining the chest, opening the eyelids, studying the pupils. But gradually, something in his expression changed. Confusion, then disbelief, then outright discomfort. He touched Caesar's wrist again, running his thumb across the paper-thin skin. This is impossible, Hayes muttered. Sutton stepped forward. What do you see? Hayes took a slow breath. The bone density is wrong. Wrong how? It's too old. Far too old. This man's skeleton is older than any I've examined. The wear patterns, the degeneration. Sutton, I'd say this body lived well over a century. Fletcher felt his stomach twist. And his teeth, he whispered. Hayes leaned closer. They show usage past 100 years of chewing. Maybe more. No modern human diet matches this pattern. And the skin. Sutton pressed. Hayes shook his head. It's degraded beyond any documented case. I cannot explain it. He sat back on his heels, rattled. In all my years, I've never seen a human body this old. Not even close. Hayes completed his examination in silence, writing notes in the corner like a man recording something against his better judgment. Finally, he stood, straightened his coat, and delivered his summary. I cannot confirm his age, he said, but I also cannot deny it. Sutton met his eyes. He was 126. Hayes swallowed. If you'd told me that yesterday, I'd have laughed you out of town. But now, he gestured to Caesar's still form. I don't know what to believe. He finalized the death certificate with one haunting line. Age, 126 years, unconfirmed, cannot be ruled out. 2 days later, on a gray morning with low clouds and damp air, they buried Caesar Bowen in Woodland Cemetery. Sutton paid for the plot himself, a quiet act of respect for a man he no longer saw as merely a patient. Only about 30 people came. But what mattered was who came. Martha Hewitt, the widow who fed him. Samuel Pritchard, who found him in the snow. Neighbors who whispered about the strange old man. A handful of black elders from surrounding counties, some traveling miles to pay respects to a man their parents or grandparents had spoken of with reverence. One woman, trembling with age, leaned on her cane and touched Caesar's coffin gently. My grandmother knew him, she whispered. She said he carried stories no book ever wrote. She said he remembered pain so we wouldn't forget it. The word struck Fletcher like a blow. Remembered pain so we wouldn't forget it. That was Caesar's legacy. A library of suffering, preserved in one fragile human vessel. As the coffin lowered into the earth, Sutton closed his eyes. He felt an unexpected weight press down on his chest. Not sadness, not fear, but something quieter and heavier. Responsibility. Because now they carried the witness. Not Caesar. After the funeral, Sutton and Fletcher returned to the cabin. They packed all 63 journals with meticulous care. Some were brittle. Some were stitched with twine. Some written on scraps of paper so fragile they nearly crumbled to dust. But every page burned with memory. Every ink stroke held a voice that had once whispered inside Caesar's mind. Fletcher opened one volume, dated 1803. Inside, a simple sentence stretched across the top of a page. If I die, the stories die. He closed the journal with shaking hands, throat tightening. Sutton placed a hand on his shoulder. They won't, he said softly. We won't let them. That night, Sutton wrote his first entry in a new journal, a personal record, not intended for publication. He wrote, Caesar Bowen is gone. But the presence that filled this cabin, the weight of the lives he carried, did not vanish. It dispersed. It felt like witnessing the soft release of hundreds of spirits returning home. And then, almost reluctantly, he added, I do not believe in the supernatural. But after tonight, I cannot claim to understand the natural world either. Outside, the wind rose through the trees, rustling the branches gently. The cabin stood quiet, its secret sealed behind old beams and aging logs. But those who attended the burial, those who saw the final peace settle over Caesar's face, all felt the same thing. A man had died, but a story had been set free. A story too large for one lifetime, too heavy for one soul, too important to be forgotten. A body laid to rest, a coroner shaken, and 63 journals waiting to reshape history. If the dead could speak through one man for a century, what truth were they trying to leave behind? History has a strange way of deciding which stories survive and which vanish. Some tales cling to the edges of archives, ignored for decades until someone stumbles upon them. Others linger in whispered folklore, kept alive not by books but by memory. Caesar Bowen's story became both. After his funeral in 1888, Greene County slowly returned to its routines. People harvested crops. Children played in dirt roads. The railroad whistled through the valley as it always had. But no one, walked past the clearing where Caesar's cabin stood without feeling something watching them. Martha Hewitt said the woods grew colder there. Pritchard swore animals refused to graze near the patch of land. Travelers claimed the trees seemed to lean inward as if listening. And local children whispered that if you stood near the cabin ruins at dusk, you might hear humming. A low, layered hum. Dozens of voices, singing a song no living person knew. Dr. Sutton, meanwhile, became a man consumed. He took Caesar's journals home, all 63 of them, and spent the next 15 years traveling across counties and states, cross-checking every name, every date, every event recorded in their pages. The deeper he dug, the more terrified he became. Because everything that could be verified was true. Names of enslaved families long erased from documents. Events lost to local histories. Secret births. Silent deaths. Whippings that left no record. Escapes that succeeded without witness. And most disturbing of all, first-hand memories of the Middle Passage described in perfect detail by a man born in Virginia. Sutton wrote in his private journal, if Caesar did not live this memory, then somewhere, somehow he absorbed it. Like a vessel filling with seawater through 1,000 cracks. But science in 1888 had no category for inherited memory. And certainly no category for one man carrying the memories of many. The medical community mocked Sutton relentlessly. They called him delusional. Too emotional to be objective. But Sutton didn't budge. He knew what he heard, what he witnessed, what he felt inside that cabin. And so, in 1895, he published a book that ruined his reputation. The Extended Witness. Inside, he presented every journal entry, every cross-checked record, every medical observation, all pointing toward the same impossible conclusion. Caesar Bowen lived far beyond natural human lifespan, and he carried the memories of enslaved people whose stories would otherwise have vanished. The book was ripped apart by critics, but it wasn't forgotten, because truth has a way of surviving even when buried under ridicule. In the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, historians rediscovered the journals. A young black historian from Ohio State described the experience as holding voices that never had a chance to speak. Another scholar found references in the journals to plantation practices that had never been documented elsewhere, but were later confirmed through archaeology. A researcher studying the Gullah language uncovered phrases in Caesar's writings that matched dialects nearly extinct by the late 20th century. And a team of archivists found that Caesar described, in perfect detail, slave ship conditions later verified through underwater archaeological expeditions, descriptions he should not have known. The scientific world still resisted any supernatural explanation. But even they admitted, no other slave narrative in American history spans as many plantations, as many lifetimes, and as many personal testimonies. Caesar's journals became one of the most important sources for understanding daily plantation life, not through white landowners or government records, but through the eyes of the enslaved. The vessel had died, but the witness survived. As for the cabin, its story grew stranger. It decayed slowly over the next 40 years, collapsing inward like a tired lung. But locals claimed it didn't decay naturally. Some swore the wood rotted faster when storms approached. Others claimed the ground around it remained warm in winter and cold in summer. In 1928, the county finally tore it down. And the demolition crew, hardened men, not prone to superstition, reported something that never made it into official records. A low song rose as the final beams fell. Voices, soft at first, then fading into nothing. The men refused to return to the site after sunset. Even after the land was repurposed, paved into a parking lot in 1965, some workers said the asphalt cracked faster over the old cabin's footprint. One man swore he heard whispering when he walked across it at night. A whisper saying, "Remember." Today, the journals remain preserved in climate-controlled archives. Scholars still debate their origin. Doctors still argue over the coroner's impossible findings. Historians still marvel at the detail. But whether Caesar truly lived 126 years, whether he absorbed the memories of others, whether the ritual performed by Amarachi truly altered his fate, those questions remain unanswered. And maybe that's the point, because Caesar's story was never about proving the supernatural. It was about proving humanity, the humanity of people the world tried to erase. His final words were not about fear, not about pain, not about mystery. They were about duty. To remember. The narrator's voice softens, a slow, haunting closing note. Caesar Bowen lived longer than any man should. He witnessed horrors no soul should carry. And when the memories finally returned to claim their time, he left behind the one thing he was never allowed in life, a legacy, one that forces us to ask, how much history has been lost because no one survived long enough to tell it? And how many truths still wait, buried, silent, for someone willing to remember them? If this story unsettled you, intrigued you, or opened your eyes to a hidden chapter of American history, subscribe, stay with the channel, and share your thoughts below. There are more stories like this. Stories waiting to be uncovered. Stories waiting to be remembered.